Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. This is According to Callus. And I guess we're going to jump right back in on the theology behind the social justice movement, right? The Theology Thursday, if you will. And I am currently reading through Fault Lines by Dr. Vodi Bakum. And I read through chapter 5, but I'm going to go back and hit a couple of highlights from earlier in the book. So he talks about this being a coming catastrophe within the evangelical movement, and some of the highlights that I want to hit on is he refers to the problem not being growing ethnic tensions, not being a political division, but in fact, the problem is social justice versus biblical justice. Now, one of the things that I find interesting, well, let me see. So he believes that the current concept of social justice is incompatible with biblical Christianity. Now, I have some acquaintances that might have a problem with that, but I got to say, I think he hits the spot right there. And he refers to a lack of clarity and charity in our debate over the place, priority, practice, and definition of justice is the issue. So, as I look at this, and I've been reading through it, and I will just say there are probably a dozen footnotes per chapter on average, maybe only 10, but the first chapter did not have very many, but later on they just seems to be like 2 pages worth of footnotes. And they're just referencing where he's getting this information as a good footnote. But he also has excerpts in the footnotes, which I think is very helpful because there's a lot of people that would take umbrage and think he's lying or making stuff up. And so that, and of course, what I'm referencing is all just in the intro. So in chapter 1, he's just kind of talking about his family life, right? How he got to be where he's at. And he references the Great Migration from 1915 to 1970. Basically, 5 to 10 million black folks leave the South and look for better lives. And they end up in a lot of big cities, right? New York, Boston, Detroit, Oakland, Los Angeles, and I think he left out Chicago. I don't know if that was intentional or not. But certainly, that's what you would expect if you're from anywhere in the North. So, gives a little family history. Talks about how he ends up in the Imperial Courts Projects in Watts. And just having come from the South and a certain amount of, I guess, greenery, it was very difficult for his mom to understand. I mean, she left to end up in Watts, and then raised him initially there, I guess would be the way I would. Now, he also references how he was a child of the desegregation project, and when he was in 3rd grade, he got bused into another school in Pacific Palisades. Now, I'm going to take a brief aside. I think I once looked in. I want to say he's about 5 years older than I am. I might have that off a little bit. But essentially, he partook in the busing scheme that was put upon us. And being that I was in grade school in the 70s, we had a couple of students that were bused into the school I was going to. I don't know that I can ever say that the couple guys that I recall interacting with were mistreated. I think that overall, aside from being jerked out of their neighborhood and put into our school, it was not a terrible experience. But I'm looking at it from the opposite side. I wasn't the guy that got displaced. I wasn't the guy that was put somewhere else. But looking back, I don't recall it being a bad situation, but I only had a reference of maybe 2 out of the, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 that they bust in. I imagine at that point they were largely volunteers, but I was just a kid. I don't really know. And when you have a school of several hundred and you've got maybe a dozen kids that are bust in, I can only imagine how awkward or off-putting that might be to be the kid that's being bussed in. So, any case, so he talks about the time in the Palisades and how, basically it just went real fast, and that his mom was quick to maintain the fact that he was going to be a good student. And when he tried to pretend to not be a good student, that didn't go well for him. So he referenced that when he got off the bus in Pacific Palisades, they were not in South Central anymore, and those folks had a lot more people. Or I'm sorry, those people had a lot more money than he did. So there is that, right? I mean, being put in a position to where you're the odd man out, that's never fun. He does briefly tell the story about how a kid that probably had no idea I don't know how I want to phrase this, because I think it's real childish to call something the N-word, but I don't want to put myself in a position where I might be misquoted at some point. So basically, he talks about how some other white kid just kept calling him nigger, and finally got tired of it and whopped him. And I gotta say, that's what I would expect. I mean, you go around calling people names they don't like, and especially if you're a kid, you're gonna get it. And I gotta tell you, I'd be hard pressed to be upset with somebody that did that. I mean, don't get me wrong. The kid that was saying it probably had no idea the implications and the baggage that terminology carries because he's a little kid. But man, he was definitely playing a game, and he got bit. And I can just tell you that in my own experience, we didn't tolerate that. I mean, it's one thing among your buddies, even when I was in the service, you can talk smack to each other, but you had to be in the club to get away with saying certain things, right? Yeah, you had to be part of the team to get away with saying certain things. That's just one of those things you wouldn't say. That's not how you talk about somebody. And he kind of referenced that, if they say it amongst themselves, no big deal. But some little white boy says it, yeah, he's playing with fire. So I get it. I can wrap my head around that. It makes total sense to me as to why that kid got whopped. And he probably deserved getting more than that if he continued to do it. But nevertheless, just skimming through chapter 1, talks about just basically mom looking out for him and sacrificing for him and doing everything she could do to get him in a better situation, being his advocate. And then, of course, not afraid to discipline, I guess this is by the time he gets, the family gets down to Texas. And he ends up getting a C on a progress report, and mom puts an end to him playing football. And, I'm of an age where I can see where a lot of parents would go advocate, well, let my little Johnny get his grade up. Don't take him out of football. Football's the be-all, end-all, or whatever the particular sport is. His mom had the exact opposite. Well, get that grade or you don't get to play football. And made sure the coach understood the how and the why of that. So that was kind of an interesting aside, but boy, that takes something to be able to go and pull that off. So then he gets to the point where he says, okay, so now that I've told you all this, so what? And his answer is this: all that I'm telling you gives me credibility to discuss these issues. So I'm going to recap this quickly. This is Dr. Vody Baucham. He says, I grew up poor, without a father, surrounded by drugs, gangs, violence, dysfunction in the toughest urban environments imaginable. Yet through all of that, I didn't just survive, I thrived. And not because of government programs or white people doing their work of anti-racism. I thrived in large part because of God's grace. My mother protected me, sacrificed for me, advocated me, and disciplined me. Now, he set that all up. He briefly touches base on when former President Obama kind of got sideways with Jesse Jackson, and talks about how they were in South Carolina for a time as well. So that's kind of the end of chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, I'm gonna probably see if I can get in all 5 of these chapters, and I'll give a few thoughts. Talks about how he dealt with the idea, and he said there's still a debate amongst black evangelicals as to whether their priority should be their blackness or their Christianity. So he rephrases that as, are we Christians or black people first? Now, again, I have the exact response he anticipates. This may seem strange to non-black Christians. Yeah, I guess it does. And then he goes on to talk about black nationalists arguing that Christianity is white man's religion, and the whites used it to encourage slaves to be docile. And even Malcolm X denounced Christianity as a religion designed for slaves. And that the Negro clergy was a curse of the black man. Of course, these are paraphrases, but the terminology is from Malcolm X. So let's just be clear that I am paraphrasing the quotes from Malcolm X. This is, he references how this is similar to Marx's insistence that religion is the opiate to the masses, right? So when you combine the two, which happens often, it becomes very anti-Christian. So when you come to faith, it requires you to overcome this objection, if you will. He does talk about how the Bible addresses this, and talks about how, you're a new creation through that. So I'm going to skip over a lot of this because you should read the book. It's more history, more just kind of getting them, basically credibility. He's setting up his credibility to talk on these specific issues. All right. So his sophomore year at college in 1989, he gets married. He's playing football and studying pre-law and international business at Rice University. Now, this is where he talks about he becomes a Christian, is when it's at Rice. And then he goes to HBU, which is Houston Baptist University. And he talks about how he's become extremely Afrocentric in his Christianity. And he gets a lot of distance, but the way he ends up there is interesting because he basically says, sure, I'm a Baptist. Now, where do I kind of find a black Baptist church in Houston? Again, paraphrasing because I'm trying to be quick about this. He just says, well, we became Southern Baptist. And so he, okay, there we go. I want to do this justice here. I remember the discussion with the registrar like it was yesterday. I asked her 2 questions. What is a Southern Baptist church, and where do I find a black one? The registrar really didn't know what to do. The registrar actually seemed more upset that he didn't want to go to church with white people. The irony of that is pretty much every white church I hear about is very much afraid that there are not enough non-white people there. I'm sorry. In any case, so he goes on, talks about a season in the desert, talks about, being an advocate, talks about some of the stuff that he did with football, and then transitioning into social work, and then his basically transition into becoming a pastor. And he ran into a guy by the name of Paige Patterson. And Paige Patterson basically got him set up, and he took notice of him and made efforts to pour into him to get him where he could be, significant individual. Which is not to say that he wasn't already, but just he was pouring into him, making. So he talks about some of the things that happened in the SBC and how he and a friend of his by the name of Bruce kind of got into some hot water. Now, what I find interesting in this is that he found the blessing in this, and that, and again, I'm trying to be quick about this. Basically, when he came along in this, he always felt like, am I really one of them? And he references the idea that black coaches in the NFL particularly, they're never really sure if they're truly equals until one of them gets fired. So basically he talks about how he gets slammed and blacklisted for, not agreeing with something. And then it was at that point that he was being treated as an equal, and he felt like that now I've made it, if you will. So he goes on, gives a little bit more talk about just different things they've dealt with at the conventions, and okay, so I'm gonna take a brief pause here and jump into where he's talking about how he had transitioned from doing his Black Power stuff, right? And here he's speaking at the PK events, right? And they're talking about racial reconciliation. And he got convicted, and he said, I was not aware of, nor have I ever met, a black pastor who was working for or even passionate about racial reconciliation. Not one had ever lamented the fact that their church was 99% black, and that the remaining 1% included exactly 0 white members. And then he's quick to say, I'm not saying that the entirety of the black church experience or those leaders were evil or ungodly, only that for the first time I was coming face to face with brothers who through tear-stained eyes were begging God to diversify the church, but all of them were white. So I guess I'm going to hold off because I have some comments, and I'm going to try and tag those on at the end. And then he talks about he didn't want to be just the black guy on staff. He knew there's some tension, particularly in church staff, when they're having the black pastors. And, there's just really never a good answer, right? And he does talk about that. And I'm going to spin through here real quick and see if I can find it real quick, what he says. But basically just talks about that no matter what happens, it's, somebody's going to attack it. There's never a good answer for a white church and a black pastor. I guess it's just the easiest way to put it. So, here we go. So, let me see. I want to make sure I do this the right way. So, finally, according to some, that season in my life was a challenge for black churches that I didn't serve. One of the most stinging charges I faced after leaving the world of predominantly black churches, what I was guilty of robbing the black church of her best and brightest. To some, the idea of well-educated, gifted, experienced ministers of the gospel who could have been serving the black church but weren't, this was treason of the highest order. And he said that one black pastor actually commented after the sermon to him, it's a shame that brothers like you take your gifts and go serve white folks. Man, guess that's something I can't imagine. I don't know what to say about that. So he jumps over to a new perspective and he talks about going to Africa. And what I want to do is, I think the best way to handle this is I'm going to break there, and that's just after chapter 2. And the reason being is in the next week when I jump back in on this, I'm going to start with the idea that he starts to find out how things are in Africa and how messed up their justice system is, how much messed up their society is in various ways, and compare and contrast it, which is what he does, to America, where he just left. And later on, the next couple chapters, he talks about various other things, and I'm going to gloss over a lot of that because it's pretty dense as far as details on specific issues. I'm just trying to give a flavor of what he's going for. And I want really to spur interest in this because, I know my limitations, and I'm not that right guy to go in and talk about that. I don't have the experiences. I don't have the understanding, which coincidentally he does touch on that a little bit in later chapters as well. And it's not that I don't have anything to say. It's just that I would rather crib what he's saying and then kind of riff off of that, if you will, because I think he's in a much better position. But I'm not going to shut up and listen. I'm going to ingest and speak back with it, as well as engage with it. We'll call it active listening, if you will. So the thing I want to leave off with, the thing that I thought was most striking to me, is when he's talking about the black churches have zero interest in having people in their church that are not black. Now, where I live, I happen to know of a church that, in fact, doesn't subscribe to that issue, or that idea, I should say, and actually has gone the other way and has been quite active in their recruitment of, non-black people to participate in their church. And kudos to them. I wish that every evangelical church would feel free to accept the church that builds around them and be happy about it. I made the comment about, nobody gets upset when you go by a Chinese church and it's got a bunch of Chinese people there. Or the Church of Formosa, which I guess would be another way of saying Chinese church. Or if you go by a Vietnamese Catholic church, well, of course, they're almost going to all be Vietnamese. You go by, Polish Catholic church. I would imagine they're by and large mostly Polish. You go by, some Indian church. There's several of them. I think one's called Ibach. You would expect to see 90% of their parishioners are Indian of some sort. I don't see a problem with this. I don't see this as a failure. Whether it's just the idea that it's birds of a feather flock together, whether it's an idea as people go where they're comfortable, and most people are comfortable around people that look like them, sound like them, I don't see that as a fault. What I would see as a fault is if you were to go visit a church as a non-member of that group and they were to chase you out the door. What I would find disappointing is if you went into a church and they chased you out, right? They had zero interest in you. And I can imagine at some point in the past that kind of stuff has probably happened. I don't know where I can imagine something like that happening now. Unless, of course, it's a Catholic church in Dallas and you don't wear your mask to go inside there. Then they'll chase you out. But be that as it may, the reality is that every culture is different. Every culture has a different way of worshiping. Every culture has a different way of studying. And, I mean, if we're honest with each other, we're uncomfortable when we're in an area that our people, whoever our people are not a majority situation, right? So if I were to go to a function and it was predominantly Latino, I might feel a little awkward. But you know what? I work around a lot of Latin guys. I'm very comfortable around most Latinos, and even though I can only understand 10% of what they're saying, most of them are bilingual, and they actually treat me quite well, and I get along with them really nice, real well. And I don't generally have issues with anybody, but I'm just using this as an example. So if I were to go to a party or whatever else, and I've always felt, I'm the odd guy here, but they don't treat me poorly. They don't single me out. I've actually been in one place where I was almost treated like the guest of honor when I very clearly was not, just because everybody wanted to say hi, meet this white guy that's at this place. So I observe the same thing, but from a different view in a lot of the political things I participate in, right? So as you might imagine, a lot of political stuff, the people are generally older than me, and they're almost, I wouldn't say universally, but very super high percentage old white people. So when I encourage young people I know, I've worked in youth ministry for about 20 years. When I've encouraged young people to go participate, I tell them, go, you're going to have a great time. Well, first of all the people that are there are going to be older than me, and they're going to be thrilled to death that somebody under the age of 25 is interested or is going to show up. So they're going to pay lots of attention to you. They're going to treat you well. The same holds true when you bring somebody along that doesn't look like them, doesn't talk like them. Now, you can read into that what you want, but I can tell you, being that I know the majority of these people, that they are very much interested in getting everybody and anybody involved. And if they find somebody that doesn't fit the mold that they belong to, they're especially interested. They want to know why they're interested. They want to know what about this part of politics interests. It would seem to me that it would be similar with many other functions. That's the thing that I have the most experience with, right? So I go to a predominantly white church that from time to time laments the fact that they're a predominantly white church, and I guess maybe feels guilty that they're a predominantly white church. And maybe that's just me reading into it, but I can't help but feel like that's the case. We're down the road, we've got predominantly black churches. I'm fairly certain that their pastor's never up there complaining that there's not enough white people here, which I guess is what Dr. Bauckham is getting at, right? I don't know that we should lament what our church looks like. We should lament if we're mistreating people. We should lament if we're including people. We should lament if people refuse to deal with us because they think certain things about us. But we should never lament the people that are present. We should never feel bad that we don't have enough of this group or that group present. No. We're in the house of God, right? We're supposed to be worshiping. We're supposed to be focusing on that. Not worried about our demographic makeup in that worship center. There are plenty of other churches, there are plenty of other places that have other makeups or different makeups, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that's my major takeaway is, so Voddie Bauckham is basically saying, look, I know that there's a lot of white pastors and white people out there that feel like, they're guilty of doing something wrong. Which is not to say that we haven't done wrong things. But me personally, whatever harm I've done is minuscule compared to 150 years ago what was allowable. So I'm not even going to own that. I don't. That's not even the issue. What he's trying to say is that's not maybe a realistic failing. That's maybe not something that is in place. And it's especially... And this is my interpretation, my understanding. Somebody else that reads this might get an entirely different takeaway. So I want to be clear about that. This is not necessarily him directly. This is my thoughts based upon what I've read. And I would think the last thing that I would want to do is go show up to a Chinese church or a black church or a Vietnamese church or a Korean church and demand that they cater to me. demand that they change everything so more people like me can come there and feel comfortable. That just doesn't sound right. It doesn't seem right. So that's my takeaway. If we're treating people right and we're being fair and objective to the best of our abilities, you shouldn't feel guilty. Now, this book is just warming up, just heating up, right? So I've gotten through chapter 2 in my breakdown or my feedback on it. The next 3 chapters light it up a little bit, and I'm looking forward to see where he takes us. The writing style is not excessively difficult to comprehend. So again, go out, buy the book, read the book, check out the footnotes. It would be well worth your time. And I think that my evangelical white folk brethren need to go read this especially. You shouldn't be motivated by guilt. You shouldn't be motivated by some misplaced concern. You need to know who you are and act accordingly. And, I want to thank Dr. Vody Backham. I did get to meet him, about a decade or so ago. I'm sure he wouldn't remember me from Adam because he met another 40 guys that weekend, or 50 guys, if you will. But I think it's good that we got a guy that's got the spine that he has and is willing to basically just throw it out there. I mean, and this is not the issue, not the only issue that this guy doesn't stand against the machine that is evangelical Christianity. I mean, and there's several other guys that are like him or have similar views, and they're holding the line. They're trying to keep us from going off the rails. They're trying to protect God's established church. Well, now that I've basically had a theological Thursday here, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time. Please go buy the book. Do yourself a favor. Fault Lines, Vody Backham Jr. And I will add some more thoughts as I read on through the book. I imagine I've probably got about another 3 weeks worth of commentary. And he has done plenty of interviews. He is everywhere in the media right now. Take advantage of listening to this guy. Well worth your time. Well, that is, according to Callis, I will see you on the other side.